All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Tuleyome's September Nature and You lecture. I'm Jeff Ben, Tuleyome's Education Associate. If you don't know, Tuleyome is a conservation nonprofit based in Woodland, California. Our mission is to engage in advocacy and active stewardship with diverse communities to conserve, enhance, restore, and enjoy the lands in our region. The region that we focus on is the northern inner coast range and neighboring areas of the Central Valley, with a special emphasis on the Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument, which we led the effort to get established and recently get expanded. In addition to that public lands advocacy work, we also do a variety of education programs, including K-12 field trips, a really great certified California naturalist course. We have a great newsletter with lots of natural history articles, and of course, this monthly lecture series. We also run a range of adventures programs, including hikes, trail building days, wildflower tours, and our youth boot bank, which provides free loans of hiking boots to kids. I've got some of our upcoming trail building days and lectures and boot bank office hours up on the screen for you here. If you'd like to learn more about these or any of our other projects, you can do so on our website at tuleyome.org. So on to tonight's lecture. Tuleyome is supported in part by donations from folks like you. So if you haven't already done so and are able to, we greatly appreciate a small donation to help support the good work that we do. For tonight's lecture, we're really lucky to have Woodland Community College professor Brian GIllespie with us. Professor GIllespie teaches biology at Woodland Community College and has been doing research at the Woodland Regional Park Preserve, which is a place that is near and dear to my heart. I spent lots of time getting kids out there on field trips, so I'm particularly excited about this one. So tonight he's going to be talking to us about native bees and the research that he's been doing on bees at the Woodland Regional Park Preserve with his students. And so during the talk, we ask that you keep yourselves on mute. If you have questions, you can put them into the chat. We'll also have some time at the end for questions as well. All right, Professor Gillespie, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that generous introduction. And I am really excited to be here with all of you this evening and talk about some really exciting and what I think is valuable work that me and students from my college have been doing over the past 4 years to better understand the populations of native bees that are a part of our ecosystems. All right. Okay, so let's just kind of start with basics here, which is exactly what are bees anyways? There we go. Well, even so, when you ask a question to a biologist, what are these things anyways? You can't help but go to an evolutionary answer because that's again so central to our understanding of biology. So what we understand from the fossil record, and you can see in some of these photos here, a lot of those fossils are insects preserved in amber that give us, the complete specimen so we can see all of their morphology and all of their details. And what the paleontologists have been able to put together is that bees seems to have evolved about 100 million years ago from wasps. Okay, which makes sense because we still classify them in the same insect order, the Hymenoptera, where they have that little skinny waist between their thorax and their abdomen. And there's a very, very clear relationship between them and also with the ants as well, but that's a little more distant. Anyways, so wasps generally make a living as predators, and it's mostly that they're hunting other insects that they capture and then drag into a nest cell, lay their eggs on it so that when the eggs hatch as larvae, they have something to feed on. And basically, what happened with bees is that they switched their diets. We don't really know why or how, although the timing of it does seem to very much coincide with the evolution of flowering plants that reproduce by the production of pollen. and the spreading of pollen. And somehow bees came along the scene, realizing that pollen was a very nutrient rich resource that if they could collect and put in nest cells for their larvae to feed upon, they would do okay. And so the evolutionary pressure on bees has been to become better pollen gatherers of all things. And so some of the adaptations and the unique features that distinguish bees from other insects are directly related to this dietary requirement. All right. So over the 100 or so million years that bees have been evolving, how many are out there today? Well, our current estimates are somewhere around 20,000 species of bees globally. All right. And then we can break that down by region, and we've got 4,000 species in North America. 1,600 species have been identified in California alone. And just to put the local spin on this, according to researchers, particularly over at UC Davis, their collection has documented 300 or so species within Yolo County itself. So there are a lot more bees than most of us think of, because when we think of bees, we probably think of what? Honeybees, right? And then we think of, maybe bumblebees and things like that. We may not think about this beautiful little creature right here in the photograph. This is one of the sweat bees, which are among the smaller species of bees, and we often don't notice them even when they're on flowers and things like that. We tend to think of them as maybe being some other kind of insect, but in fact, they are a bee. All right. So again, bees can often be confused with other insects. And so how do we kind of tell them apart from each other? Um, and particularly when you're hanging out in a flower bed and you see other insects visiting flowers, it can be easy to kind of mix them up a little bit. So the way you can figure out whether an insect is a bee, first and foremost, actually it's number 2 on the list here, they're hairy. Again, that's that evolution of the relationship for gathering pollen, having extra hairs on their bodies. These are great places for pollen to get stuck onto, mostly through electrostatic. It's just static connections on all that kind of a thing there. But what you might see if you look carefully at the photo of the bee here on the left, you'll see this little colored golden patch on their leg. All right. And that would be a location where pollen is specifically collected on very special hairs that we call scopal hairs. And scopal hairs are just the ones that are really well adapted to collecting and holding on to pollen. But they have a lot of hair all over their bodies. So they're much fuzzier than other insects. They're usually a little bit thicker across the body, although they do have that narrow waist. They're kind of compressed a little bit, so it doesn't look like they have an obvious waist. And so they kind of look more thicker body. All right, so you can look for the hair, look for the presence of pollen grains or stuff like that. Comparing that to the wasp, represented as the ancestors they evolved from, usually not very hairy, much more obvious skinny waist, and usually much longer and kind of spiny legs. And then the other insects that you often can mistake for a bee or even a wasp hanging out on a flower, there are a number of species of flies that also visit flowers to collect either nectar or occasionally a little bit of pollen, but mostly for nectar because that's sugar water to them. And it's a simple, easy carbohydrate, a great nutrient. But you can usually distinguish flies separate from the others is they're a little bit shorter, thicker bodied. They don't have the narrow waist. And in particular, their eyes are disproportionately a greater part of their heads. They have like really, really big compound eyes and very, very short antenna that don't stick out very far from their faces. Whereas you look at bees and wasps, they have really, really long antenna. All right. So think about that the next time you're watching insects on your flower gardens and see who's buzzing by and what you're going to see and what you're not going to see, and see if you can play the game of, is that a bee? All right. So let me give you a little background on the nature of bees a little bit. And again, the big story about bees is their relationship with flowers. And the reason that they go visit flowers is for two reasons. They're one, again, they're looking for nectar because that is their direct energy source. Because what we're seeing visiting the flower is an adult animal. And this is really their only source of nutrition at this point in their life, is just to dive into the flower, go deep. They have long proboscis type structures around their mouths that allow them to get in there. Although actually the length of that can vary quite a bit from species to species. Uh, but basically, that's what they're using to get by on a day-to-day basis. But then there's the pollen gathering. And the pollen gathering is primarily the province of the females of any bee species. Because again, what they're doing is collecting the pollen to put into a nest where they can then lay an egg. And we're going to go through their life cycle here in just a second. But they collect pollen not for themselves, but to feed their offspring. All right. So, and one of the things that's really cool and was interesting to me when I got started in this whole research program was learning how, in spite of the picture of honeybees with their massive hives and thousands of workers and some drones, and it's all kind of quote unquote managed by a queen, everything like that. Most bee species are actually solitary dwellers. Okay. They don't live in hives. So, in order to keep up their life cycle, a single female digs a nest. And basically, what she does is that, and we're going to kind of look at this a little bit out of order, but if we look over here in the lower right, where we have an adult, again, adults forage the flowers, collecting pollen and nectar, and they even regurgitate a little bit of that nectar, and then they glue all of the pollen grains together, and they make a big pollen mass that they stick in their nest. And usually, the nest they can do, half a dozen to a dozen eggs over their lifetime. And each one is put into an independent cell, and they lay an egg on it. And then the egg hatches, and you get a little worm-like larva, as with stubby little legs, barely much of a visible head. They don't look like, they're not very impressive, to be honest, but they're hungry. And so they then feed on these pollen grains. And why pollen? Pollen is incredibly nutrient rich. It's very good in protein and in lipids, which are very necessary for their development. And then again, they get a little bit of sugar, a little bit of carbohydrate from what's gluing it all together. So from here, they will feed on that big pollen mass that's sometimes referred to as a bee bun. I think it's kind of clever. Or bee bread is another term I've sometimes used to describe these masses. Once they've kind of gotten their fill and they've grown enough, they can then go into a metamorphosis. And so they will go into a pupa stage, they'll encapsulate themselves, and then they get the big body transformation and then emerge as a new adult. And then the adults leave the nest and then they go about doing their bee business. No, particularly if you're a male, you go around and your only job when you hatch and you come out of your pupa stage as a male, find a female. You know, and that's kind of it. They don't help with the nest. They do nothing else. They're just there to mate with a female, get her pregnant, give her a good supply of sperm, and then she goes around and starts her new nest and starts this thing all over again. And it's a pretty short life. Most of these solitary bees maybe only live 6 to 8 weeks. But by that time, they will have produced many, many offspring and ready to go on. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of these, again, these nesting strategies. So as I mentioned, most of the bee species that are native to anywhere in the world, most of them tend to dig holes in the ground to make their nests. So there are many, many ground dwelling species. And again, that's a big distinction. That's something most people don't appreciate about them because we tend to think of honeybees with their big honeycombs and all of that kind of stuff. Even bumblebees, if some of you may be familiar with bumblebees, they also make very small colonies, usually about a half a dozen to a dozen individuals who they're basically all sisters of the same mother whose job it is just to keep laying eggs and making more siblings, while the rest go out and do all of the nectar and pollen gathering and things like that. You also have these interesting species called stingless bees that are primarily found in the tropical areas of the world. We've got a picture over here of part of the hive of stingless bees. And yeah, they kind of live up to the name. They don't have modified um, structures in their abdomens to use for self-defense or anything like that. That doesn't mean that they're not um, that they can't injure you if you come across one of their hives and mess with them, because they still have jaws. They'll bite. So even though they're stingless bees, don't think that they're harmless, because if you mess with them, kind of like what's happening in the picture over here, I'm sure the individual here was probably bitten several times as a result. Okay, so we have our ground dwellers, but again, many of our solitary species do things like, if they're not digging in the ground, they're using plant material. They will carve their way into woods. These are the group of bees that are sometimes called carpenter bees. And they kind of get that name because of their association with dry wood. Um, there are actually a number of other species, though, that find dead twigs that have hollow cores to them. And they can chew their way through into the hollow center of old twigs and use those to build nesting chambers and things like that. So again, there's a lot of variety and a lot of strategies that bees are capable of utilizing for nesting purposes. Uh, and again, if you kind of were to look into some of these nests, like in one of these twig dwelling nests, some species um, will subdivide the sections using um, the gather clay or mineral materials, or they will extract resin from tree sap and things like that, and they will create these partitions you can see here in the photo on the right. And again, each partition is a single cell. You can see a mass of bee bread and either an egg or a larva there. I'm not really sure what that is. And then there's a really interesting group of bees that we'll talk a little bit more about. They're known as leaf cutter bees. And they're one of the ways that they prepare their nest is that they go to plants and they cut little sections, often very circular sections, out of leaves and then use them to line the nest and create subdivisions and then even cap them off. And so they're really cool bees because they have, very scissor-like jaws that allow them to snip and very carefully cut these things out in a very short amount of time. And so they're um, just kind of using that as another kind of protective lining, which is really kind of neat and interesting. Okay. All right. So why do I even get to talk about this? Well, it's because I got involved a few years ago um, in a little research program. So I actually originally was not a bee biologist. I wasn't even into entomology in any ways. My actual training is in marine biology of all things. So I was really trained to deal with ocean creatures. But um, when I started working for Woodland Community College, and in my role there, I am primarily the professor for biology majors, so everybody pursuing a biology degree, um, and helping future scientists get ready. I was always interested in making sure they understand research. Research is so critical to everything that we do. Even if you're eventually going to go on to med school and become a doctor or a physician's assistant or something like that, I want all my students to understand scientific research and where we get information from. And so I really wanted to find some kind of a project that would be long term that I could keep students involved in and give them opportunities. And then back in 2022, I got kind of a cold call email inviting me to join this project that we now call the Buzz. Um, that was generated by Professor Jeannie Chari of College of the Canyons with Dr. Patricia Palavicina at Antelope Valley College, and an expert on the identification of bees, where they got a small NSF grant to kind of kick this off and kind of do proof of concept. And I was fortunate enough to be accepted into this program back in 2022. And then as we've been fortunate to get a longer NSF grant that's funding us for 5 years, we've been able to add some more principal investigators, but more importantly, we've really been able to increase the number of participants in the program. So currently, as of this last year, we have professors and students representing 29 community colleges from all across California and even into Arizona. And fundamentally, what we're doing is this: we're going out into our respective areas and collecting native species of bees and recording their identification. And we're recording what kind of flowers that they appear to be visiting to get either nectar or pollen. What are the resources that they need? And our overall goals are multifaceted. And of course, one of our bigger goals, since we're all from community colleges, we really want to give students this opportunity to get involved in undergraduate research, because that's something that's very difficult in the community college system. Almost all community college instructors are teachers first and foremost. We are there to be in the classroom and helping to develop our students. So research isn't expected of us, and many of us don't really do a lot of it very actively. Um, but that means that our students don't get research opportunities the way they can at like a UC Davis or a UC Merced or a Stanford or any place like that, where their professors are always doing research and can give their undergraduates an opportunity. So we wanted to try to help give them a leg up before they transfer. Um, but then it was like, well, what is the project going to be? We wanted to do something that was important. All right. We wanted to uh, be able to not only give students research, we wanted to do something that meant something to a bigger problem. And there's definitely a problem with pollinators in our ecosystems. And there is plenty of data to indicate that populations of all kind of pollinating species that are in decline. And so we felt that it was really, really important to better document where all these species are occurring within our regions, and begin to build a database that would allow us to then creating habitat that would sustain bee populations um, and all of that. Um, so by doing that, then we can increase native bee biodiversity. And of course, the other big thing in our grant is that sharing this information with all of you. So again, I'm very thankful for Jeff for inviting me to fulfill this part of our one of our objectives, which is just community engagement, and to let you know. And we'll end up with what things that you guys can do out there to help with this. All right, I'm going to pause right here for a second. I got a chat question that came in from Barbara, who is curious about seeing lots of dead or dying bees and wondering if pesticide is doing it. But then, since many of them have short lives, do they tend to be natural deaths? That's actually kind of a big question. And I guess it depends. First, I would have to ask you, well, exactly what species of bees are you seeing there? Because honeybees definitely are often found not so much dead, but they can go into an overnight torpor. If they don't make it back to their hive and temperatures drop down, they'll just kind of go to sleep temporarily. And then, so if you just kind of leave them alone and check back on them in a few hours when things warm up, they might be gone. And it may be just they just woke up. So it's kind of a difficult question to fully answer there, whether these are natural deaths or not. Okay, cool. All right, another comment here. So Gretchen here is saying lots of leafcutter bee activity on redbud. Absolutely, redbuds are one of the um, great plants to support a lot of different bee species. So that's really good. Okay. All right, well, let's get back to our talk here for a little bit. Okay, so just kind of wanted to give you a little bit of uh, information that, again, I've been doing this project for 4 years now. And so I had a great opportunity to go back through all of the data that we've been working on. And this is kind of a summary of, well, what have we found so far? And again, it's kind of interesting. So we have primarily been collecting bees mostly on our own campus. If you've never been to the Woodland Community College campus, we're kind of blessed in that one of our major programs on campus is our agriculture program. So we have greenhouses and we have all kinds of demonstration gardens as well as a student field for uh, growing plants and practicing agricultural practices out there and things like that. So that actually gives us a lot of opportunity for having a lot of flowering plants, plus just our general landscaping has a number of flowering plant species. So we actually are pretty good for attracting bees. Um, and then, particularly in the last 2 years, as part of our project, I've been going out to the Woodland Regional Park Preserve because I've been involved in the development of that um, area actually even before I started the bee research. I got involved in that back in 2021, working with Tuleyome and other community representatives to bring that park into existence. And so, I mean, I'm also very excited that we opened it this last year. That was awesome. But through my connections there, I've been able to get into the property on occasion, and we've been starting to sample for bee diversity and to see what this wildlife preserve is kind of currently doing and what maybe we can hope to do in terms of as it develops and as we continue to manage that land, particularly for native plant species, will this have a rollover effect and be a benefit to that? So those are kind of our two primary locations. We've also sampled a few other offsite areas just for comparative purposes. But over the past 4 years, we have cataloged 300 specimens of bees. And this graph kind of shows you a little bit of the um, breakdown of bee species, at least by genus. Actually, getting to species we've learned is really kind of difficult, mostly because the identification keys for bees to species level are not always complete and don't always encompass all of the areas. So we mostly focus on the genus level of identification rather than getting to species. If we can get to species when we have easy kind of markers, we'll do it, but otherwise, we tend to look at them as at a genus level. And so what we found is that out of 300 species we've collected over 4 years, almost half of them have come from a single genus known as Halictus, which is one of the genera for what are called sweat bees. Um, and then second most, a genus called Megachile, which are the leafcutter bees I talked about earlier, as well as the genus Xylocopa, which are the large carpenter bees. Okay. And then actually our fourth most common um, are another genus of sweat bees known as the Lasioglossum, kind of a thing there. And if you're curious as to what these animals actually look like, here's just some samples of at least three of the genera. So uh, first and foremost, we've got over here in the upper left, Halictus legatus. So again, this is a very common sweat bee. They visit a wide range of local flowers. They're actually have turned out to be somewhat of a generalist, which I guess is good for them because they're not tied into any specific plant host for their resources, unlike some other species and genera of bees that are very plant specific and they only want to get pollen from a certain organism. Over here in the upper right, we've got Xylocopus sonorina, or one of the large carpenter bees. These are probably some of the largest. And I'm sure to many of you, if you've ever encountered one out there, they seem very intimidating because they have a very loud buzz because obviously their size. I mean, these things are, 5, 6, 7 centimeters in length. They're babies. They're so docile. They don't want to mess with anybody. They just want to get their pollen and get their nectar and really not do anything else. So just because they're big doesn't mean that they're dangerous or anything like that. I kind of enjoy having them around now. Gotten used to them. Okay, and then we've got another Halictus down here in the lower left, Halictus tripartitus, a little bit smaller than the legatus, which is kind of cool. And then over here in the lower right, we've got one of the Megachile, and again, if you remember, I've talked a little bit about how bees collect pollen on hairs and especially the hairs on their legs. And you can see that on the Halictus, you can see all this yellow on their hind limbs. That's all covered in pollen. What's interesting about the Megachile and other members of their family is that they don't really have long hairs on their legs so much as they have them underneath their abdomens. So if you look over here, this long yellow section right here, those are just their hairs. And this is where they collect their pollen, is that they keep them on the undersides of their bellies, kind of, so to speak. Um, and that, again, kind of makes them pretty interesting and a little bit different than a lot of the other bees. All right. So let's talk about what is going on and what have we been learning out at the Woodland Regional Park Preserve. So for those of you, if you're not familiar with the property, here's a little bit of the history of it. Going all the way back to 1900, the plot of land, which is located on kind of the eastern, sort of southeastern side of Woodland off of County Road 102, just about 3 miles south of I-5. It's a 160-acre plot of land that used to just be grazing land. But then the city of Woodland gained ownership of it back in 1935, and their big idea for this land was to make it the city dump. Okay. And then as sanitation practices evolved, it got converted into a more proper sanitary landfill. But the city discontinued those operations back in 1981 and converted the land where they capped off all of the landfill areas with just mounds of dirt. So if you ever go out to there, if you see kind of the hill-like mounds behind the pond, that's where all the garbage is, very deep down underneath there. All right. But then what kind of happened, and again, thanks to Tuleyome and a whole bunch of citizens just interested in doing something more with this land, which between 1981 and 2020 was largely used for informal recreational purposes. Probably one of the most famous was a local model airplane club got permission to build an asphalt landing strip in the area, which now serves as our parking lot for the park. So we've been able to do a few things there. But our interest in preserving this area is mostly the fact that many of the areas are host to some very rare plant species here in California. Number one on the list would be the palmate bracted birdsbeak, which is a federally listed endangered species. And so we're one of the few areas, as well as the rare alkali milk vetch, saline clover, alkali heath. Basically, it's because of the soil characteristics. And again, some of you may already be in the know and you realize that the Central Valley has all of these cool little pockets of alkaline soil that then host unique plant species. And this 160-acre plot of the Regional Park Preserve is host to that kind of thing. So we kind of give you a map here, an overlook of the park preserve. Again, so this is County Road 102 over here on the western border, County Road 25 on the northern border. And so all this big square right there. And you can kind of see that much of the area in green, this is annual grassland. It's pretty much the typical California Central Valley foothill vegetation of mostly introduced grass species, but with a good mix, and periodic oak trees and other tree species kind of dot the landscape. And the outlined areas you can see on the map here, these were the landfill mounds where everything was capped off. And of course, where did they get the dirt to cover all of the garbage? Well, they dug it out. And so this used to be sort of the excavation pit that we have turned into our permanent wetland. But it's here on the outer edges, up in the northwest quarter and the southwest quarter in particular, is our alkali prairie. And so these are where many of these rare plant species, particularly the palmate bracted birdsbeak, is roughly in this southeastern section right there. And by the way, we do have signs warning people, please don't go traipsing through there. In fact, we try to keep people out of the vegetation as much as possible. All right. We also have a lot of wetland areas, which again are mostly tules and reeds and things like that. But there are some edge type areas where some other plants that bees visit tend to show up there. And of course, we have urban ruderal, which is basically just disturbed landscape, where we've plowed over and changed things, and it's just a huge human impact on all of that. So particularly in this last year, from April through June, me and one of my student interns made several visits to the park to collect bees at the various locations that you can see here marked on the X. So again, mostly in the alkali prairie, a little bit on the areas where we have just a lot of, introduced or, sort of unwelcome weedy species um, are here in the area where we've done the most kind of physical development. It's like, where we have the parking area and the kiosks and storage sheds and all that kind of stuff right there. So, probably the heaviest human impact are in those areas. And of course, we have our ADA compliant walking trail around there, and there's a lot of various vegetation. We've, tried to mix in, a lot of as many native plant species as possible. We have a lot of red bud, as was mentioned earlier, good for bees, um, as well as willows and some valley oaks and things like that have all been added along the property right there. All right. So I'm just going to share with you um, the data that we got from just this last year. Unfortunately, I didn't really have enough time to really consolidate the past 2 years worth of data. But what we can find here is that when it comes to the kind of bees that we were finding in the preserve, a reasonably good mix, although not really a balance in terms of representation. The most abundant bee species, or at least genera that we found, were again from the Megachile, which were the leafcutter bees, and then the Halictus, the sweat bees, and the Laseoglossum were the ones that we came across the most in our sampling protocol. And then we had a few others from a genus called Asphodelia, which actually was exciting for this year. It was the first year we have ever caught any bees from that genus in the past 4 years, which was, it's always cool to kind of add more. How bird watchers have their life lists. Us bee collectors kind of have our life list too, and it's always exciting to add somebody new to the list. Um, so we got that. We have got a couple of the large carpenter bees. Melisodes are known as longhorn bees, and in fact, this bee in the lower center of your screen as an example of a Melisodes with again these really really long pollen collecting hairs on their legs, things like that. And then a couple of other rare species, Ceratina and a Hylias. So overall, what we got? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like eight genera represented. Most of them, obviously, where there's only one, then they represented also a distinct species. We just didn't identify what that species was. Um, the Halictus were mostly from the two that I showed you earlier. They were either Legatus or Tripartitis. The Megachiles, I think, were all uh, probably from one species, but we didn't have time to narrow that down. So reasonable diversity. And even though I don't have a slide for it, the previous year we had a slightly different mix of species. So it does seem to change from year to year a little bit. And maybe that has something to do, and we'll talk a little bit about some of their nesting habitats and their abilities to do that. Okay. But the other thing that we're always tracking is, well, what are the plants? And this is where things get interesting when it comes to understanding the bees of the preserve. Because when we look at the plants we collected these beads off of, um, I'm sure, again, for those of you in the know, this is probably not a welcome name. Pepperweed, highly invasive, not really a welcome plant. We're doing a lot to try to minimize its presence on the preserve, and yet it hosted the most bees. Mostly Halictus, which, as I mentioned, are kind of generalist, and they use a lot of different plants. So that could be a thing. Again, a lot of our bees we collected from a blooming Palo Verde tree that's located on the kind of alongside the road as you're driving into the park. Um, uh, but interesting, again, Palo Verde's not really native to the Central Valley. They're more, you know, Sonoran Desert, and in northern Mexico, places like that. And then we get to things like yellow star thistle, bird's foot trefoil. Again, you're noticing that most of the plants that we're collecting these bees from them, these are not our native plants. Um, we do have some from, like, we did collect some from some native dandelion, salt heliotrope, from spikeweed, or sometimes known as gumweed. So, and I think that's my next slide here. So if we kind of break it down by some of the major habitats, like out in the annual grassland, um, again, you can kind of see the numbers that we got here. And although we did collect some from um, things like native milkweed and native spikeweed, we got a lot more bees from our non-native plants. You go to the edge of the wetland, where mostly all that we saw growing in that area was convolvulus or bindweed. Um, the version of it is probably not native, as well as the bird's foil trayfoot. Not very many bees that we collected from there. There really wasn't a lot of activity on that particular site and that particular visit. And then again, in the highly disturbed urban rural area, where again, it's dominated mostly by pepperweed. Um, and then later in the season, it wasn't in our season, but you also get a lot of yellow star thistle that also tends to host a lot of uh, native bees. But we also found in some of those areas, again, California dandelion, here's our salt heliotrope, and you can kind of see what all we got from there. So, again, interesting, the story here is that when it came to what kind of plants the bees were visiting, by far it was kind of 2 to 1. Bees were on non-native plants versus the native species. And so that concerns us a little bit, just because, well, our hope and our intention with the preserve is to do as much weed abatement as we can afford to do and reduce the non-native plant species and encourage more native plants. And so the question has sort of come up to us, is like going, well, if we continue with that program, how is that going to affect our bee diversity in that area? Um, but we actually don't think this is going to be a major concern if the park itself is limited in terms of non-native plants. If we can do it, and we know that we're never going to get rid of all of them. I mean, that annual grassland, that's such a huge amount of area. We're never going to get the non-natives out of there. And it's just not realistic. But even if we do get rid of as much of the pepperweed and things like that out of there, we're actually not concerned about having a major impact on our native bee populations, because the whole area is bordered by um, other landowners who leave their fields fallow, and all of those same weed species are plenty and abundant in the surrounding areas. So I don't think reducing 160 acres of non-native plants to minimal levels is probably not going to have anything. The native bees easily have access to all kinds of areas. And in fact, we are hoping, and this is something that we're still in the process of, we're still trying uh, to pay more attention to the native plants and seeing which kinds of bees are very much tied to our native plants, and that if we can improve the native plant diversity, we're going to have actually an add-on effect, and we'll actually end up with more native bee diversity as a result of it. Again, there were a number of bee specimens that only came from one particular genus, and and if I look back over a couple of years, again, there are some very specific associations, like during the wet season or just after the wet season, when the vernal pools have dried out and start to bloom with their native plants. There's a native bee genus that we only collected on goldfield flowers, for example. And so that was so we do believe that as we continue to manage the preserve and improve the plant diversity, we're going to get better bee diversity as a result of it. All right. So I mentioned that we wanted to do this project again because we wanted our students to get involved in some kind of research program that really mattered. And so that's kind of the question. Why do we care about bees? Well, again, bees as an ecological role are extremely important spreaders of pollen. Any pollinators, and you see other examples of them, not just bees, bats, butterflies, hummingbirds, even certain species of flies, even some of the wasps. I mean, if you're an animal that nuzzle your face into a flower, you're going to get pollen on you. And then you're going to spread it to another plant. And this is how the flowers and this is how these plants reproduce. All right. So pollinators are essential ecosystem services because they help maintain plant populations of all kinds. Okay. And bees are important for these flowering plants because flowering plants, first and foremost, this is our major food supply. I mean, other than like grains, which are usually wind pollinated, but so many other important crop plants um, require pollinators of some form or another. And not just food, you know, plant oils, fibers like flax, other raw materials. Um, and of course, plants we know, help maintain soil quality and soil erosion. And of course, the pollinating animals, especially the bees, they support other organisms because they themselves now are a prey species for insects, animals that feed on them. And so they're just another part of the food chain and the food webs and the whole ecosystem. So, maintaining healthy pollinators is a key component of maintaining healthy ecosystems. So again, back to the food thing a little bit. Again, use anywhere depending on your region and what are the dominant crops, but anywhere between 75 to 95% of flowering plants need pollinators in order to reproduce. And that equates to, easily a third of almost all of our food is only available due to pollinators, whether you're talking bell peppers, tomatoes, you know, banana. I mean, just you name it. There's so many things that require an animal to come by and spread the pollen from one to another. In fact, some are very specialized. I talked about tomatoes. Most tomatoes are naturally pollinated by species of bumblebees because only bumblebees have the ability to release the pollen when they land on the flower. They're able to vibrate their wings at a very specific frequency that get the anther heads to open up and collect the pollen. And then, so if um, you don't have bumblebees, the only other way to get tomatoes is to hand pollinate. You got to get in there and shake them up or break open and transfer them by hand. Um, can you imagine having to pay workers to go out there and hand pollinate tomatoes? Whereas bees are going to do it for free. So they're really, really important, and according to the United Nations in one of their studies, the pollination services provided by bees are able to help with 15 out of 17 goals for sustainable development that have been identified by the UN. Again, everything from maintaining our quantity and quality of food, being sources of nutrition and medicine. So many important medical drugs were originally discovered by looking at botanical compounds in plants. And if those plant species aren't propagated through pollination, where's the pharmacopoeia going to come from? All right. You know, interest in biofuels. Again, a lot of biofuels, plant-based. So we need pollinators to do that. And just having a healthy and diverse ecosystem. So bees are really, really important for that. And so that's why we're excited about this work, is that we're getting more data that we're not just collecting for ourselves. When we upload our data, it gets transferred into an internationally available database so that researchers around the world, if they want to know what kind of bees are present in different areas of California or Arizona and what kind of flowers are they associated with, they can go to that database and we're contributing to that. So we are really helping, I think, provide more information. Okay. And bees are in trouble. You know, someone in the chat mentioned earlier a question about pesticides. Yes, pesticides are a great concern, particularly pesticides that contain compounds called nicotinamides, which are lethal to many insects, which of course is the point of the pesticide. But what we've learned is that when they originally tested doses of them on plants, they didn't think that they were that bad. What they didn't realize is that these chemical compounds get in the pollen, and that the doses that end up in pollen grains are lethal to bee larvae. And so even though the adult bees don't look like they're being harmed by it, we're stopping the life cycle. So that is a huge question that we need to take a look at and go, oh, is this the best product to be using? And can we look at alternatives? Of course, other challenges that bees have, climate change, which is a litany of challenges to bees, between displacement from their native ranges and the displacement of their native hosts because their host plants aren't adapting to climate change, they're going extinct. And many bees do become specialists. And if their native plants can't survive climate change, there go the bees too. And of course, habitat loss. And I feel that, for good or for bad, I think, again, if you noticed in our data that in 4 years, we've only collected maybe, and again, I'm not firm on this, but around 21 species of bees are in our collection right now. But the longer term research in the area, 300 species of bees in Yolo County. Why aren't we getting more? And I think part of the reason is, well, we are limiting our collection to Woodland area, which is in the heart of the Central Valley. I think most of the 300 species are up in the coast ranges. I think I would love an opportunity to start going up into Berryessa and collecting at maybe different altitudes and seeing what else would we get out there would be a future direction that I would like to go to someday. But I think that Woodland being in very much the heart of an agricultural zone, and that so much of the landscape has been altered to meet food production purposes. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Obviously, we need to grow food for human population. But the alterations that we make to their habitat, I think, have had a very negative impact on levels of bee diversity, especially compared to other areas of California. When I compare our data to that of other schools, we definitely have less diversity. And I think it is because of habitat loss as a result of it. So again, a couple of studies, particularly one that came out just about 10 years ago, showed that there's 25% fewer species are being reported than historical records indicated. So yeah, we are concerned. We are very much concerned. And part of that, again, is also due to concerns about, well, what are honeybees doing? Okay. And maybe some of you are asking, well, why aren't you even studying honeybees? Well, number one, honeybees are all introduced. All honeybee populations in North America originated from Europe, different areas of Europe. Okay. And so although they've definitely become naturalized to North America, and it took them 250 years from the first bee colonies that were added to um, the East Coast colonies before the nation's founding, and travel across the country. They're there, but again, they're not native. And some of you may be familiar with her concerns about honeybee populations going into decline themselves. And there have been their own challenges, again, due to pesticides, due to fungal infections, due to viral infections, that have severely diminished the commercial honeybee industry. And so one of the concerns for the agriculture sector is, well, they rely on honeybees to do most of their pollination services. If honeybees were to somehow be eliminated, can the native bees pick up and replace them? And there's a lot of research that's being done right now looking at which species of native bees might be able to kind of make that transition a little bit. But I think it's vitally important that we keep as many species around because of their ability to diversify their pollination habits. And so the more information we know about what's currently here, we can also make recommendations that if honeybees no longer become a viable option for pollination services, what can we do with the natives? And again, California has 1,600 bee species. One of them are honeybees. That's 1,599 other species of bees that can help pollinate our plants. So what can you do? How can you help? It's so easy to help native bees. First and foremost, if you have any kind of dwelling or home, you can plant bee-friendly plants. I mean, I've got a picture right here. This is actually from my own backyard where I just took a large planter and scattered seeds of bee-friendly plant species. It's not big, it's about what, 2 foot in diameter. Um, but you can see it's got lots of different flower species and lots of different flowers, little bits of pollen, lots of nectar, even a small little bit. And that's just one part of it. I've got other plantings and just the natural landscaping of my property um, is able to host a large number of native bee species. So anything you can do, whether even if you live in an apartment, you could put a small pot on a patio maybe and at least make something. Okay. The other thing though that's really important for bees is providing places for them to build nests. That's kind of the unseen aspect of bees because that's just as important part of their life cycle is having a place for females to lay their eggs and giving them a safe place to do it. So if you own property, keep areas more or less free of plant material where ground nesting bees can then dig in and make their own nest in the ground. Or if you have branch cuttings as you're trimming your vegetation, don't just throw it in a waste disposal bin. Find a corner, stack it in there, let it dry out. Bees will visit those twigs and try to make nests out of them. Okay. Or if you really want to get fancy, and here's the other picture in the lower right, you can get or make what we call a bee hotel. It's basically large blocks of wood that we drill different size holes into. And all of those wood nesting bees, they love it. They will dig in here. You can all see some places that have been closed over. So, excuse me, so they can fill up. I've even had broods emerge over the past couple of years that I've owned this thing. Um, and that's only one. I've got another one too, which is also very well used. Um, and it's just a matter of, you know, just kind of tracking it. And as it gives pretty good sign evidence that holes have been used up and are vacant, this can be opened up and you can go in and clean out old abandoned nest and remaining materials and do this on a regular basis. You just one of the things that you kind of have to do though is um, try to kind of preserve it against some of the elements a little bit. So I have this like hanging up outside, but then I can take it and just like store it in my garage over winter. So that way it's not subjected to the rain and the cold weather, which could have a negative impact on larvae that are overwintering. Because that happens a lot. A lot of times these nests are built at the end of summer and early fall. And when they go into their pupa stage, they'll go dormant over winter if it's too cold and they won't finish their metamorphosis until springtime and then they'll emerge and we get the new generation. And then the third big thing again you can do is try not to use commercial pesticides as much as possible. And talk to, and if you use them or if you use a pest control service, talk to them about what their ingredients are and look out for those nicotinamides and try to suggest alternatives so that way they're not getting into the food chain that these bees rely upon. So, I mean, it's not a lot at first, but I think if every person did a little bit of something for the bees, I think they would definitely be a lot better off. And one thing we have seen in our data, because we do collect a lot of bees in our project across the state, and a lot of the collection sites are in heavily urbanized areas. We have several schools in the Los Angeles area, and they're able to find and provide information about how to maintain good habitat for bees, even in a major urban zone. So don't think that, if you live in a city or live in a highly urbanized area that you can't do anything. Bees can adapt. Out of the 1,600 species of bees in California, 400 are known to frequent urban areas. So, okay. Oh my gosh. Okay, I got behind. I lost track of the chat here, and we get all kinds of things popping up here. So, that's kind of actually it for the talk here. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second, but I'm kind of go through some of the questions here. Um, and so what native plants can be added that are useful to native bee species? One of the big winners for native plants also happens to be the state flower, the California golden poppy. We've collected probably 4, 5, 6 species that visit golden poppies. So that's a really good one. As I mentioned, the salt heliotrope grows at the preserve definitely has some of the smaller, more obscure species are really, I think, really good um, in terms of native plants. Um, but even though we always want to talk about native plants because they're better adapted to California's climate and things like that. A lot of non-native plants that are for horticultural purposes, for landscaping purposes, they're still really good for bees that have adapted to them. So things like, sages, almost any kind of sage um, is really popular for many native bee species. So you could definitely add that into your mix. Um, um, I think another non-native plant that's also pretty good for them. I want to say, oh, okay, not native. How about a native plant? Goldenrod. Goldenrod is another really, really good one. Um, Ceanothus. Ceanothus species are really good. So got quite a bit there. Okay. All right. So we got Elaine. Do you find honeybees competing with native bees? It really depends on which genus you're talking about in terms of native bees. Honeybees are very generalist. They will go to a wide range of flowers. So I think they're probably bigger competition for other generalists. Um, so like the sweat bees in Halictus, they probably have to compete a lot because I see them on a lot of the same flowers. And the research on this is actually kind of mixed. I've read some papers that say honeybees definitely um, when they're present, we see lower abundance of native bee species. And then I've seen other research that indicates that they seem to be able to coexist at the same time. Um, so I think on the average, though, I think definitely in a location where there is a high honeybee population, I can't imagine it not having a negative impact on limiting resources for the native bees. And so um, I'm trying to keep track on that research myself a little bit more to see when we get more definitive answers. But I have noticed, I do remember um, the first year I was on the project, we did one day of sampling out at the park preserve, and the city had allowed a beekeeper to put several hive boxes on the property. And so when we went out collecting, it was like honeybee after honeybee. It was really hard to find native bees. 2 years later, when the city stopped allowing the honeybees on property and the honeybee populations were visibly not as abundant, native bees were more present. So that's anecdotal. It's not strong science, but I think it's something that we want to kind of keep track of. Okay. We also had a question. Which genera do you find of what are called bumblebees? The genus is called Bombus. All of the bumblebees are in the Bombus. And currently, California has kind of listed all members of Bombus, at least species of concern, with a couple that are close to being listed on the endangered species list. So, and that's actually one of the things that has affected our data collection is because it can be difficult to distinguish bumblebee species. There's a lot of phenotypic plasticity that distinguishing them just by their visible markings isn't always easy. We have a protocol in place where we do not collect bumblebees unless we have gone through training sponsored through the Xerces Society on how to humanely collect and anesthetize bumblebees long enough to ID them and then wake them up and release them back into the environment again. I have not been through that training, so me and my students, we don't collect bumblebees, and so we have no data on them locally. Okay. All right. Some other questions here. One or more properties along 102 have planted a field border with a diversity of native species. Has he made any observations there? We're sort of we've done a lot of sampling near the edge on the south side of the border, um, but we haven't crossed the border in anybody else's property. So um, um, haven't been able to make any observations along that line there. Okay, and we got a point there. But yeah, tomatoes, that's true. Tomatoes are capable of self-pollinating, but um, yields are lower, and if you're really trying to get a good tomato crop, you definitely want to have bees um, into the mix there. Okay. So, yeah, Gretchen mentions, this is a good thing that native bees are favoring non-natives. Well, it's good for them, definitely. But what, again, I worry about are the true specialist bee species that have not been able to switch over to some of the non-native plants. Um, so,
Brian, do you have a sense of what proportion of our native species are real specialists in that way versus generalists?
um, just on the data I have alone, um, and one of the problems, unfortunately, a lot of the specialists are also on flowers that have really short bloom periods. And if we don't get out there when they're blooming, we don't know about them. And that's again just the practicalities of trying to do real science is that, I have to balance my full-time job, my student schedules and things like that. It's like I missed a whole bunch of blooming at the preserve this last spring that I wanted to get to, but it just schedules just didn't align to let us do that. Um, so um, we have so far most of the bees that we've had in our collection are definitely generalists because we're dealing with flowers that have long blooming periods that allow for different species that have different phenologies, different timings in their life cycles. So I would hate to make any definitive statements just because we have a lot of sampling bias. Okay. We have Dave was asking about bees going into pollination. Hopefully, I think I kind of addressed that. That yeah, oftentimes there are bees that will hatch and feed off of their food stores and then go into their pupa state. But if the timing of that stage is at kind of the end of the summer or in the fall, and the temperature drops, then yeah, they'll just go into dormancy and wait to emerge until the springtime. Yeah. Robin mentions that native bees can supply same pollination services. In some cases, yes, but also one of the challenges with native bees compared to honeybees, again, honeybees, they make hives of thousands of workers. And so they're very effective pollinators by sheer numbers. And they can do, a good acreage with just a few hive boxes. If we don't have that, the native bees don't have that same kind of population density. And so, yeah, it'd be great to have more native bees doing our pollination service, but I don't think they could keep up with modern agricultural demands. And so it is kind of a big question is again, if we lost honeybees, that could really collapse the agriculture sector economically and really produce major food shortages of so many otherwise valuable crops. And so, yeah, that would be kind of bad. All right, Sabine, is there a good database of which native plants are especially beneficial? All right. Yes. Thank you for everybody sharing some links right there from California Native Plant Society, Calscape, um, UCDF. Yep. Good stuff right there. So, yeah, thank you for providing some of that information there. All right. And then Sabine also mentions bee hotels can be a problem if they also host bee mites and other diseases. Yeah, that's definitely a problem. And sort of a challenge, trying to manage mine and trying to keep them kind of clean um, without disturbing existing nests. Uh, kind of, you know, um, but yeah, you definitely want to definitely get them kind of cleaned out and um, try to not let things get underway because yeah, mite infestations are another kind of challenge to bees, um, like any insect. Okay, so I think that gets us through most of the chat. So does anybody have any other live questions that you want to throw at me? Oh, we've gone way over time too. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. This is supposed to be done by 8.
Oh, lots of interesting things to talk about. One general question I had was, what does your like collection procedure look like out in the field?
Okay. Our basic protocol is we identify um, kind of an area of plants that are in bloom. Try to keep it something that is more or less kind of within arm's reach. So it's usually about a 3 to 4 foot long by 1 to 2 foot wide area. And we kind of camp out there for 30 minutes. And we use aerial nets and we just net them, trap them in the net, and then we do transfer them into a jar with a chemical agent that will euthanize them, transfer them into collection containers. Um, and then we take the bees back into the lab for cleaning and identification purposes. And then after 30 minutes at one flower patch, then we can move on to another one. And depending on our stamina and the weather, we'll be out there for an hour and a half to 2 hours.
Yep. All right. Do we have any other questions for Professor Gillespie? All right. Well, I'd encourage folks to make sure you sign up for our next Nature and You lecture, which would be our last one of 2025. It's coming up end of October. And that's going to be an author talk on a new book that's coming out on exploring the Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument with Bob Schneider and Mark Hoshovsky. So thank you again, Professor Gillespie. It was a great talk. It's a fascinating topic. And I'll certainly be examining the little flying insects on flowers a bit more closely now.
All right. Well, again, thank you so much for having me. And again, I just appreciate everything that everybody does because I'm sure most of you are very supportive of Tuleyome and conservation in general. And I can't thank you all enough for preserving ecosystems.